They said her husband's funeral was a testament to a life well lived. For Elizabeth Vance, it was a preview of her own burial. In the gilded cage of her Greenwich home, surrounded by people performing grief like a stage play, she was already becoming a ghost. Her son and daughter-in-law saw her not as a grieving widow, but as a final obstacle to their inheritance. They would push her down into the cold, damp earth beneath her own feet and call it an act of love. But in that darkness, a forgotten fire would begin to glow. This is the story of a woman they tried to erase, and how she rose from the ashes to burn their world to the ground. If you believe in justice and the quiet strength of those who are counted out, then follow our channel, like this video, and hit that notification bell. You are not going to want to miss how this ends. The air in the house was thick, a cloying blend of white lilies and the subtle, dusty scent of old money. It was the smell of Richard's entire life, now condensed into a single suffocating afternoon. Elizabeth Vance sat in the wing-back chair by the grand fireplace, a piece of furniture she'd chosen 52 years ago, and felt like an intruder. Her own home had become a stage, and she, the lead actor's widow, was merely part of the set dressing. Men in sombre, expensive suits murmured condolences, their eyes flicking past her to the oil paintings on the wall, their minds already calculating, appraising. Women with taut, ageless faces touched her arm with brittle fingers, their voices like rustling silk, whispering, "He was such a pillar of the community," or "You were so lucky to have him for so long." Lucky. The word echoed in the hollow space Richard's absence had left. Was she lucky? She looked at the portrait of him above the mantelpiece, painted a decade ago. The artist had captured the public Richard perfectly, the confident set of his jaw, the intelligent gleam in his eyes, the almost imperceptible smirk that people mistook for benevolent wisdom. But the artist hadn't seen the man who came home after the galas and board meetings. He hadn't captured the silence that was a weapon, the subtle corrections that chipped away at her confidence, the way he could stand in a room and make her feel utterly, completely alone. For 50 years, she had been the silent partner in the corporation of his life, a beautifully maintained asset. Now, it seemed, the management was changing hands. Her son, David, was holding court near the bay window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. At 45, he was a softer, less defined version of his father. He had Richard's height, but not his posture. He was trying, she could see that. He was shaking hands with a firm, practiced grip, his face a mask of solemn responsibility. But his eyes, they were restless. They weren't seeing the mourners. They were measuring the dimensions of the room, cataloguing the antiques, redrawing the floor plan in his head. He was the new lord of the manor, and he was already impatient for the old queen to abdicate. And then there was Chloe. Chloe was a masterpiece of modern grief. Her black dress was tailored to perfection, her hair a sleek, dark sheath, her makeup subtle enough to suggest sorrow, but flawless enough for a magazine cover. At 38, she moved through the crowd with the predatory grace of the influencer she used to be. Her social senses honed to a razor's edge. She was a smiling shark in a sea of well-dressed fish, and she was swimming directly toward Elizabeth. "Elizabeth, darling." Chloe's voice was a low purr as she knelt beside the wingback chair, enveloping Elizabeth in a cloud of expensive funereal perfume. Her hand, cool and smooth, rested on Elizabeth's forearm. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a claim. "How are you holding up? It's all just so much, isn't it?" Elizabeth looked into her daughter-in-law's eyes, a perfect polished hazel, and saw nothing but ambition. "I'm managing, Chloe. Thank you." "Of course you are. You're so strong," Chloe said, her tone dripping with a condescension that was almost admiring in its audacity. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if they were sharing a profound secret instead of plotting a coup. "You know, David and I have been talking. Once the dust settles, we'll need to start thinking about a more manageable living situation for you." She patted Elizabeth's arm. "This big old house, it's a tremendous amount of work. It must feel so terribly empty now." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cold as shards of glass. A manageable situation. Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the old windows. It was the cold dread of realization. The will hadn't even been read. Richard's body was barely cold, and here they were, already planning her obsolescence. David drifted over, drawn by Chloe's gravitational pull. He placed a hand on the carved mahogany of the mantelpiece, his fingers tracing the wood as if testing its quality. "Chloe's right, Mum," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too hearty. He wasn't looking at her, but at his father's portrait. "We need to be practical. Dad would have wanted us to be practical." He was using Richard against her. The final, perfect irony. Richard, the master of control, was still controlling her from beyond the grave, his legacy of pragmatism being wielded by his son to evict her from her own life. "We just want what's best for you," Chloe added, her smile a perfect white lie. "A new chapter, for all of us." Elizabeth looked from her son's covetous gaze to her daughter-in-law's predatory smile. The sounds of the reception faded into a dull, meaningless hum. The faces of the guests blurred into a watercolour wash of feigned sympathy. In that moment, her grief for her husband, a complex 50-year tapestry of resentment, duty, and a long-extinguished love, was eclipsed by a new and terrifyingly simple emotion: fear. She was no longer Elizabeth Vance, the widow. She was an obstacle, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that they were already planning how to remove her. The scent of lilies was finally gone, scrubbed away, and replaced by the sharp, sterile perfume of Chloe's favourite lemon and eucalyptus cleaning spray. The last of the sympathy cards had been cleared from the hall table, the last of the half-eaten casseroles tossed in the trash. The performance of mourning was officially over. Now the business could begin. They sat her down in the formal living room, the same room where the reception had been held. It felt different now, stripped of its sombre purpose. It felt like a boardroom. Elizabeth sat in her wing-back chair, a queen on a throne about to be usurped. David and Chloe sat opposite her on the plush sofa, a united front of calm, rational concern. Chloe had a tablet resting on her lap. "Mom," David began, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. He was trying for sincerity, but he couldn't quite meet her eyes. His gaze kept skittering away, to the window, to the pattern on the Persian rug. "We've been doing a lot of thinking, and a lot of research." Chloe tapped the screen of her tablet, and it lit up with charts and graphs. "The real estate market is volatile, Elizabeth," she said, her voice the smooth, reassuring tone of a financial advisor about to deliver bad news. "Another crash is predicted for late 2025. It's simply not a good time to sell, but holding on to an asset of this size, with the property taxes and the upkeep, it's not financially prudent." Jargon. They were burying their intentions under a landslide of corporate speak. Consolidate assets, maximize potential, mitigate risk. Elizabeth felt a wave of dizziness. This wasn't a family conversation. It was a hostile takeover. So, David cut in, taking a deep breath. Chloe and I, we want to move in. There it was. The proposition laid bare. We can't let this house stagnate, he continued, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. He was trying to convince himself as much as her. Dad poured his entire life into this place. It was his legacy. We have to protect that legacy. We'll do a full renovation, Chloe chimed in, swiping through images on her tablet. Pictures of sleek, minimalist kitchens, of grey walls and glass partitions, flashed across the screen. Modernize it. Bring it into the 21st century. It will increase the value exponentially. It's the smartest move for the family. For the family. The words were a shield they held up to hide their own greed. Elizabeth looked at the images of the cold, impersonal rooms they planned to create and felt a profound sense of erasure. They weren't just renovating a house, they were methodically deleting every trace of her existence within it. She remained silent, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her silence unnerved them. They had expected tears or arguments or a display of sentimental weakness. Her stillness was a rock they hadn't anticipated. Chloe changed tactics, her voice softening, becoming syrupy with false empathy. Of course, Elizabeth, your comfort and safety are our #1 priority, which is why we've come up with the perfect solution for you during the construction. This was it, the final move in their carefully planned game of chess. The basement, David said, the words rushing out of him in a single guilty breath. It's all finished. It's got its own entrance from the garden, a kitchenette, a full bathroom. You'll have complete privacy, your own little apartment. We'll make it so cozy, Chloe added, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of her own magnanimity. A sanctuary for you, away from all the noise and the dust and the workers. We worry about you with all that commotion, the stairs. It's really for your own good. We'll be right upstairs if you need anything at all, just a little call away. A sanctuary. A prison, she thought. They were offering her a cage and calling it a nest. She looked from David's face, now flushed with the shame he was trying to suppress, to Chloe's, alight with triumphant charity. She saw the entire plan laid out with clinical precision. They would move her down, out of sight. They would take control of the house, of the finances, of everything. They would isolate her, until she was nothing more than a signature on a document, a name on a bank account they could access. And she was so tired. The fight with Richard had lasted 50 years, a quiet, grinding war of attrition that had worn her down to the bone. She didn't have the strength for another one. The thought of arguing, of pleading, of fighting for her own home against her own son was exhausting. It was easier to yield. It had always been easier to yield. She looked at the portrait of her husband. He seemed to be smirking at her. See, he seemed to say, they are my children after all. A long, slow breath left her body. It felt like the last of her fight going with it. Her shoulders slumped. All right, she whispered, the word barely audible. If you think it's best. The relief that washed over David's face was sickening. Chloe's smile widened, a flash of pure, unadulterated victory. They had won. It had been easier than they'd thought. Oh, Elizabeth, that's wonderful, Chloe breathed, reaching across to pat her hand again. You see, It's all going to work out perfectly. Elizabeth didn't answer. She just sat in her chair, in her living room that was no longer hers, and felt the profound, bottomless sense of defeat. This was not an invitation. It was an eviction notice, served with a smile and a lie.
She was being exiled to the underworld of her own home. And she had just handed her jailers the keys. The descent was swift and brutally efficient. They didn't ask her to pack. Chloe handled it, which meant a team of impassive movers in grey uniforms descended upon her bedroom and study, packing 50 years of her life into cardboard boxes with startling speed. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, a silent spectator at the dismantling of her own identity. She watched her favourite reading lamp, the one with the hand-painted silk shade, get wrapped in plastic and labelled storage. She saw a box of her late husband's books marked donate. Her cherished furniture, the pieces she had chosen and lived with for decades, was herded toward a waiting truck, destined for a climate-controlled unit miles away. Chloe had deemed it too dated for the new aesthetic. When the time came to move her, David was conveniently absent, caught in an important meeting. Chloe guided her to the top of the basement stairs, a hand on her elbow, her voice a stream of bright, cheerful instructions. "Mind the step, Elizabeth. It's a little steep here, see? We've had a new handrail put in, just for you." The first thing that hit Elizabeth was the cold. It was a damp, subterranean chill that seemed to leach the warmth from her bones instantly. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something metallic, the smell of the furnace that squatted like a great iron beast in a far corner. Cosy was the word Chloe had used. The reality was a long, rectangular room with concrete floors painted a dreary battleship grey. A thin, cheap-looking rug did little to soften the space. Her grand four-poster bed was gone, replaced by a narrow, functional metal frame bed with a thin mattress. A particle-board wardrobe, a small formica top table, and 2 hard-backed chairs completed the collection of soulless furniture. Against one wall was the promised kitchenette, a miniature refrigerator that hummed loudly, a microwave and a single hot plate. But the worst part was the window. It was a single high, horizontal slit near the ceiling. It offered no view of the sky or the garden she had lovingly tended for half a century. It showed only the ground level of the outside world, tangled grass, dirt, and the occasional pair of passing feet. It wasn't a window. It was a constant, taunting reminder of the life that was now taking place above her, without her. It was the view from a grave. Her isolation was immediate and absolute. The heavy door at the top of the stairs closed with a solid, final-sounding thud. The world above became a muffled landscape of sounds. She could hear the indistinct murmur of voices, the sharp clicks of Chloe's heels on the new hardwood floors they were already installing, the distant rumble of the television. She was a prisoner listening to the sounds of her captors' lives. The promised visits were rare and brutally transactional. A tray would appear on the top step of the stairs, not brought to her, just left. A sandwich, often with a single slice of processed meat, its bread already starting to go stale. A bowl of lukewarm soup, a plastic cup of water. It was the food of an institution, devoid of care or thought. When they did come down, it was never to ask how she was. It was always because they needed something. "Mum," David would say, standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, avoiding her gaze, his phone in his hand.
Chloe's sorting out the utilities. She needs the password for the online Hydro account. Elizabeth, Chloe would call down the stairs, not bothering to descend. I can't find the folder with the property insurance documents. Do you know where you put it? Each request was a small, sharp twist of the knife, a reminder of her powerlessness, of the fact that she was now just a repository of old information, a human password they needed to access her own life. She tried to make the space her own. She arranged the 2 framed photographs she'd been allowed to keep, one of her parents, one of a much younger David, on the small table. But they looked pathetic, lost in the grim emptiness of the room. They didn't make it feel like home. They only emphasized how far from it she was. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of cold, silence, and the humming of the mini-fridge. She felt herself shrinking, her world contracting to the 4 damp walls of her cell. The fire of her initial fear and betrayal had cooled to a bed of dull, hopeless embers. This was her life now, a slow, quiet fading. Then Mia came. Her granddaughter's visit was a carefully orchestrated event. Chloe brought her down, her hand on the 18-year-old's shoulder, a bright, proprietary smile on her face. Look who's here to see you, Elizabeth. Mia missed her grandma. Mia looked deeply uncomfortable. Her eyes, so much like David's, darted around the cauldron, taking in the cheap furniture, the single high window. Elizabeth saw a flicker of horror in them before the girl quickly masked it. Hi, Grandma, Mia said, her voice small. She held a small bouquet of daisies, already slightly wilted. Isn't this nice? Chloe prompted, her voice gratingly cheerful. Grandma is so snug down here, it's her own little private suite. The conversation was stilted, painful. Chloe hovered over them like a prison guard, steering the topic to safe, meaningless subjects. Mia's college applications, the weather, a new show on Netflix. Elizabeth could feel her granddaughter's pity and her fear. Mia was trapped, caught between a dawning awareness of her parents' cruelty and the ingrained loyalty of a child. The visit was winding down. Mia was scrolling aimlessly through her phone, a nervous habit. Well, we should let your grandma rest, Chloe said, already moving toward the stairs. And that's when it happened. In a gesture that might have been accidental, or might have been a small, desperate act of rebellion, Mia angled her phone. For just a second, Elizabeth saw the screen clearly. It was an Instagram post, a photograph, bathed in the warm golden light of the upstairs living room. Her living room. It showed Chloe, smiling serenely, her arm wrapped around a professionally clad woman in scrubs, who was also smiling. It was a perfectly staged photo, radiating warmth, compassion, and virtue. And then Elizabeth read the caption. So blessed to be caring for my beloved mother-in-law in our home. It's not always easy, and the sacrifices are real, but family is everything. A reminder to everyone to cherish your elders. They are a gift. Hashtag family first. Hashtag elder care. Hashtag blessed. Hashtag making memories. The world went silent. The hum of the refrigerator, the sound of Chloe's breathing, Mia's fidgeting, it all vanished. There was only the glowing screen, the beautiful, smiling lie. A masterpiece of public deception built upon her private misery. The blatant, breathtaking hypocrisy of it was like a physical blow. The photo of Chloe's caring face juxtaposed with the cold, damp reality of the concrete box around her. The hashtag blessed, while she ate stale sandwiches alone in the dark. It was the cruelty of it, not just the neglect, but the performance. The need to profit from her suffering, not just financially, but socially, mining it for sympathy and praise online. Something inside Elizabeth, something that had been dormant for 50 years, snapped. The embers of her defeat, her sorrow, her resignation were suddenly blasted with oxygen. They didn't just glow, they ignited. A cold, hard fury, pure and clean as ice, began to form in her chest. It was a feeling she vaguely recognized from a lifetime ago, from before Richard, before she had learned to be quiet, to be small, to yield. She looked up from the phone, past Mia's worried face, past Chloe's oblivious smile. She looked at the single, mocking strip of window. They thought they had buried her. They thought she was finished. But they had made a critical mistake. They had given her nothing to do but think, and nothing to lose. The image burned behind her eyes. Chloe's false smile, the hashtag, the lie that had been broadcast to the world, a lie so perfectly crafted, so publicly declared. And in the cold, damp silence of her prison, Elizabeth Vance felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Not fear, not sorrow, but the slow, steady, powerful beat of a coming war. The victim was gone, and in her place, a strategist was drawing her first breath. The damp had a particular smell, not just of earth and mildew, but of time, of things forgotten. Down here, in the tomb they'd made for her, time moved differently. It didn't tick by on the grandfather clock in the hall, it seeped through the concrete, a slow, cold stain. The silence was the worst part. It was an active, pressing thing, broken only by the groan of the furnace or the muffled footsteps from the world above. Her world, now occupied by strangers who wore her sons' and daughter-in-law's faces. In that profound quiet, the past wasn't just a memory. It was a roommate, and its name was Richard. She saw him, not as he was in the polished walnut casket, but as he'd been in the living room, a glass of scotch in his hand, holding court. It was a dinner party, perhaps 30 years ago. One of their friends, a professor, had been discussing a new political theory. Elizabeth, who read voraciously, offered a thought. A memory, sharp as broken glass, played out against the grey wall. "That's an interesting point, John," she had said, her voice clear and confident. "But have you considered the Malthusian implications? If you take that policy to its logical extreme..." The room went quiet, all eyes on her. Richard had chuckled. It was a sound she knew well, not of amusement, but of dismissal. A small, polished weapon. "Oh, Lizzie," he'd said, patting her hand as if she were a child who had just uttered her first complex sentence. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about Malthus. You just make sure Bob's glass stays full, all right? You're so good at that." The guests had laughed, a nervous, polite titter. John had looked uncomfortable for a moment before changing the subject, and Elizabeth had felt the familiar hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She had smiled, picked up the decanter, and retreated into her role as the perfect, silent hostess. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted her directly. He had simply erased her. He had done it for 50 years. Another memory surfaced, this one in the kitchen. She had wanted to buy a new set of gardening tools. It was her money from a small inheritance her own mother had left her. She'd mentioned it over breakfast.
Gardening tools, Richard had said, not looking up from his newspaper.
What's wrong with the ones you have?
They're rusted through, dear. The trowel handle is splintered. He had sighed, a long, weary sound of manufactured patience. Elizabeth, we have to be practical. You know how the market is. Every dollar counts. Let me see the budget. He made her justify the $27 expense. He had her pull out the ledger where he insisted she track every penny, from groceries to the single stamp she bought at the post office. He'd scanned the columns, his finger tracing her entries. You spent $12 on that fancy coffee last week, he'd pointed out. If you'd just stuck with the store brand, you'd have half the money for your tools already. It's about choices, Lizzie. Fiscal responsibility. She hadn't bought the tools. She had wrapped the splintered handle in electrical tape and kept quiet. It was never about the money. It was about the questioning, the justification, the slow, methodical erosion of her autonomy, until asking for a new trowel felt like petitioning a king for a favour. He isolated her from her own finances, then from her friends, and finally from her own family. Her sister used to call every Sunday. After one too many times of Richard answering, sighing, and saying, "She's in the middle of something right now, can it wait?" the calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. He framed it as protecting her time, as managing her social obligations so she wouldn't get overwhelmed. Lying on the lumpy cot, the thin blanket pulled up to her chin, Elizabeth felt a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. The words David had used when he'd suggested this arrangement echoed in her ears. "Mom, let's be realistic. The stairs are a hazard. We just need to be practical about the upkeep of the house. It's for your own good, your own safety." The same condescending tone. The same justification of cruelty as practicality. The same framing of control as care. Richard hadn't died and left her alone. He had simply passed the keys to the warden. David wasn't just his father's son. He was his father's apprentice, and he had learned his lessons well. The realization didn't bring despair. The well of despair had run dry long ago. What replaced it was a hard, dense thing, like a diamond forming under immense pressure. She had spent 50 years being managed, controlled, and erased. She had let her husband shrink her world down to the size of a dollhouse. She would be damned if she let her son shrink it down to the size of a basement. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about ending a legacy. Richard had succeeded for 5 decades. David would not get a single year. The nights were the longest. The faint, rhythmic thump from upstairs was the only company she had. The bass from Chloe's late-night workout videos. A steady, mocking heartbeat. Then one night, a different sound. A soft scratching at the top of the basement stairs, followed by the slow, agonizing creak of the door. Elizabeth sat bolt upright on the cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. "David, come to deliver another pronouncement?" A sliver of light cut through the darkness, and a small figure slipped through, pulling the door carefully shut behind her. "Grandma?" The whisper was terrified, fragile. Mia. The girl tiptoed down the concrete steps, clutching a thermos and a small paper bag. In the dim glow of the single bare bulb, Elizabeth could see the girl's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. I brought you some tea," Mia stammered, her voice barely audible. "It's chamomile and a muffin from the bakery. The lemon poppy seed one you like." She set the items down on the rickety end table. Her hands were trembling. Elizabeth reached out and took one of Mia's hands in her own. It was ice cold. "My dear girl," Elizabeth said, her voice rough with disuse. You shouldn't have. If they find out. I don't care, Mia whispered fiercely, though tears welled in her eyes. I hate this. I hate what they're doing. I hear them talking. Mum was on the phone with her friend, laughing about how they'd finally solved the Elizabeth problem. Dad he just lets her. He talks about you like you're a line item in a budget. The description was so accurate it sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine. Mia sank to the floor, huddling beside the cot, as if the darkness could hide her. I tried to say something. I told Dad it was wrong. He told me I was being overly emotional and that I didn't understand adult matters. He said you were happy down here, that you wanted the peace and quiet. Elizabeth squeezed her granddaughter's hand. It's not your fault, Mia. You are a good person in a difficult situation. No, it's not okay, Mia insisted, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I live here too. I eat their food. It feels like I'm a part of it. I see Mum's posts on Instagram. Pictures of the living room, all redecorated. She uses hashtags. Family first. Caring for our elders. It makes me sick. So, that was it. The performance wasn't just for their friends. It was for the entire world. A carefully curated lie broadcast for likes and comments. The anger inside Elizabeth solidified further. These nightly visits became their ritual, a dangerous whispered conspiracy. Mia would bring news from the upper world. Chloe was planning to rip out the rose bushes Richard had planted. David was complaining about the capital gains tax he'd have to pay when he sold the house. Each piece of information was a small, sharp stone Elizabeth added to the growing pile of her resolve. She learned to live for the sound of that creaking door, for the warmth of the tea, for the connection to this girl who was her only ally. She felt a fierce, protective love for Mia, a feeling she hadn't realized she was capable of anymore. This wasn't just about saving herself now. It was about saving Mia from the poison that flowed through the veins of this house, from the influence of her own parents. One evening, about a week into their secret meetings, Mia seemed more agitated than usual. She paced the small, clear space on the concrete floor, wringing her hands. They were arguing tonight, she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. Dad wants to do something with papers, legal papers. Mom said he needed to be more aggressive, to get it over with before she gets any funny ideas. That's what she said, before she gets any funny ideas. Elizabeth felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. What kind of papers? I don't know. I couldn't hear everything, but Dad has a briefcase and he said he'd talk to you tomorrow. Mia stopped pacing and looked at her grandmother, her young face etched with a desperate seriousness. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a small, slim object. A cheap plastic-wrapped phone. I used my allowance, she said, pressing it into Elizabeth's hand. It's a burner. Prepaid. No contract, no name attached. I told the man at the corner store it was for a school project. Elizabeth stared at the phone. It felt impossibly heavy, a dense block of potential and peril. It was black and anonymous, a promise of a voice in the suffocating silence. Mia, she began, but the girl shook her head. Just in case, Grandma, Mia whispered, her eyes pleading. Just in case you need to call someone who isn't them. Please, just take it. Hide it. Elizabeth closed her trembling fingers around the device. It was more than a phone. It was a weapon. It was a lifeline. It was the first brick she could use to build her way out of this cellar. She looked at her granddaughter,
this brave, terrified child, and knew that her fight had to be won.
Not just for her own freedom, but for the future of the only person in this family who still had a soul worth saving. She hid the phone inside the lining of the old mattress, a secret seed of rebellion planted in the heart of her prison. The days that followed were a torment of waiting. The phone was a hot coal under her mattress. Every creak from upstairs was David coming with his papers. The waiting frayed her nerves, but it also sharpened her mind. She spent hours staring at the unfinished walls of the basement, the exposed pipes and wiring, the raw skeleton of the house. And as she stared at the poured concrete foundation, a memory, dormant for years, began to stir. It wasn't a memory of shame or control, but of something else. Pride. Richard's pride. He had been obsessed with the construction of his study. It was his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude on the main floor. He'd overseen every detail, from the mahogany panelling to the built-in shelving. She remembered him one afternoon, standing in the middle of the half-finished room, a blueprint in his hand, a rare, genuine smile on his face. He'd been talking to his then-partner, Arthur Chen. A flashback, vivid and clear, Richard tapping a section of the blueprint. "This is the beauty of it, Arthur," he'd boasted, his voice resonant with self-satisfaction. "They see a library, floor to ceiling, first edition classics, the image of a well-read man. What they don't see is the architect's flaw." "The flaw?" Arthur had asked, peering at the plans. "My flaw. My design." Richard had grinned, a wolfish, triumphant expression. Behind this entire section of shelves, a hidden compartment, not a safe, a room, steel-reinforced, soundproofed. That's where the real work gets done. That's where I keep my most valuable assets. He had never spoken of it again in such detail. To her, it was always just the study, a place she was tacitly forbidden from entering without an invitation. She'd never known the mechanism, the secret switch or combination of books that opened the passage. It was his ultimate secret, a physical manifestation of the parts of his life he kept hidden from everyone, especially her. Staring at the grey concrete wall, Elizabeth's mind raced. Valuable assets. What would a man like Richard consider his most valuable assets? Not first-edition books, not sentimental photographs. He was a man who worshipped at the altar of finance and control. It had to be documents. The real deed to the house, perhaps in her name alone, hidden away. Financial statements, ledgers that detailed holdings he never spoke of. Anything and everything he would need to maintain his power, even from beyond the grave. Anything that could give her leverage. The study. It was a symbol of 50 years of his impenetrable control. Now it was her only hope for liberation. The key was in that room. The checkmate was in that room. Her mind became a frantic archive, sifting through decades of throwaway comments, of half-heard conversations, of moments she had dismissed as unimportant. Had he ever let a clue slip? A favourite book? A nervous habit when he stood near that wall? A number he repeated? The gears of her mind, long silenced by grief and oppression, began to turn, grinding with a new and desperate purpose. The hunt had begun. The sound she'd been dreading finally came. Not the gentle creak of Mia's visit, but the heavy, deliberate tread of a man on a mission. The basement door swung open with a decisive bang, flooding the stairwell with light. David stood there, silhouetted against the brightness. He was holding a sleek leather briefcase. "Morning, Mum," he said, his voice imbued with a false, cheerful efficiency.
He descended the stairs, his expensive shoes crunching on the dusty concrete. He pulled the single wooden chair over to her cot and sat, placing the briefcase on his knees with a soft click of its latches.
"Hope you're doing all right down here," he said, not meeting her eyes, instead busying himself with the papers he was pulling from the case.
"Chloe's thinking of ordering you one of those memory foam mattress toppers. For your back." Elizabeth said nothing. She simply watched him, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her heart a cold, steady drum against her ribs. "Anyway," he continued, clearing his throat, "I had a chat with a friend of mine, a lawyer, a very sharp guy. He was reviewing your and Dad's estate planning, and he pointed out a few vulnerabilities." He fanned a thick stack of documents out on the small end table. The top page was dense with legal jargon, but the title was stark and clear: Durable Power of Attorney. "It's just a formality, really," David said, pushing the papers closer to her. "It gives me the ability to manage your finances and make healthcare decisions on your behalf. With Dad gone, someone needs to be able to pay the bills, talk to the doctors. It just streamlines everything, makes it all much more efficient for your care." His care. The words were a bitter acid in her mouth. She stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page, a blank space waiting to swallow her last remaining shred of autonomy. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She let the silence stretch, filling the space between them. David's manufactured patience began to fray. He shifted in his chair. "Mum, it's just a signature. It protects you. It ensures everything is taken care of." Elizabeth finally looked up, meeting his eyes. She allowed a slight tremor into her voice, a flicker of confusion into her gaze. It's a lot of words, David. My eyes aren't what they used to be." His facade cracked, just a little. A flash of irritation crossed his face before being replaced by a mask of deep, patronizing concern. "Mum, let's be realistic," he said, his tone shifting, becoming harder. The voice of Richard. "You're getting forgetful. You misplaced your glasses 3 times last month. What if there's a real emergency? What if you need to be moved to a facility and someone needs to sign the admission forms quickly? If you don't sign this, well, our lawyer friend says the alternative is that we'd have to petition the court." He let the words hang in the air. Petition the court. "We'd have to present evidence of your cognitive decline," he continued, the words chosen with surgical cruelty. "We'd have to ask a judge to declare you legally incompetent. For your own good, of course, to protect you from yourself. But it's a messy, public process, embarrassing for everyone. This," he tapped the paper, "is cleaner, simpler. It keeps things in the family." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a loaded gun on the table between them. "Sign away your life, or I will have it taken from you in a courtroom." This was his checkmate. He believed he had her trapped. She was just a confused old woman in a basement. What could she possibly do? Elizabeth summoned every ounce of the actress she'd been forced to become over 50 years of marriage. She let her shoulders slump. She looked at the papers with a weary, defeated air. "It's so much to take in, dear," she murmured, touching the stack with a trembling finger. "Richard always handled these things. Could I just have a day to read them over? I want to try to understand." David studied her for a long moment, searching for any sign of defiance. Seeing only the frail, confused mother he wanted to see, he relaxed. A small, triumphant smile touched his lips. He had won. "Of course, Mum," he said, his voice softening back into its caring disguise. "Take all the time you need. I'll come back for them tomorrow."
He stood, snapped his briefcase shut, and ascended the stairs, not looking back. The door closed, plunging her back into the familiar gloom. The silence returned. But this time it was different. It wasn't empty. It was charged with purpose. Elizabeth waited. She counted to 500, listening for any sound of his return. There was nothing. With movements that were slow and deliberate, not frail, she reached under the lumpy mattress. Her fingers closed around the cool, hard plastic of the burner phone. She pulled it out, the secret key to her future. Her hands were perfectly steady. She turned it on. The small screen glowed with an alien blue light, a star in her subterranean night. She navigated the simple menu, her mind sharp and clear. There was no hesitation. She knew exactly who to call. She typed in the number she hadn't dialed in over 15 years, a number she had committed to memory for an emergency she never thought would come. The phone rang once, twice. A gruff, cautious voice answered. Hello? Elizabeth took a deep breath, the damp basement air filling her lungs. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was not asking for permission. She was not being managed. She was acting. Arthur, she said, her own voice sounding strange and powerful in the stillness. Arthur Chen, it's Elizabeth Vance. The sharp, insistent chime of the doorbell cut through the artificial quiet of the house. David, halfway through a glass of scotch he'd poured at 10 in the morning, set it down with a thud. Chloe looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed in annoyance. Unscheduled visitors were a threat. He opened the door to find a man who seemed to have stepped out of a bygone era. He was in his late 70s, with a kind face, sharp eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles, and a tweed jacket that looked both expensive and comfortable.
David, it's been a long time. You may not remember me, Arthur Chen. I was a friend of your father's, and your mother's, of course.
David's smile was a strained, awkward thing. He remembered the name, Richard's lawyer, the one who retired years ago. Mr. Chen, of course. This is unexpected. Please, come in. Chloe, joining them, her voice a cascade of synthetic charm. Arthur, how wonderful to see you. We were just saying how we need to have more of Dad's old friends over. Arthur Chen. His eyes twinkle, but they miss nothing. Oh, I was just in the neighbourhood, visiting a client. Thought I'd be terribly remiss if I didn't stop by to pay my respects to Elizabeth, see how she's settling in. The phrase, settling in, hung in the air, like dust motes in a sunbeam, visible and irritating. David, well, she's resting. It's been a difficult time. Chloe, we can certainly pass along your well wishes. Let me get you some tea. David, help Mr. Chen with his coat. They sat in the formal living room, a space Chloe had already begun to update, with sterile beige furniture that seemed to reject the very idea of comfort. The tension was thick enough to be a third guest at the tea party. Arthur stirred his cup, the tiny clinking of the spoon against the porcelain the only sound for a long moment. Arthur Chen. This is a magnificent house. Richard was so proud of it. So many memories here. I imagine it's a great comfort for Elizabeth to be surrounded by it all. Chloe. Oh, absolutely. That's why we moved in. To help. It's too much for one person, you know. The upkeep. The memories. Arthur Chen, nodding slowly, taking a sip of tea. A noble undertaking, and Elizabeth is comfortable with the new living arrangement? David shifted in his seat. The question was a scalpel, disguised as a feather. David. She's adjusting. It's a big change. We thought it best she moved to the ground floor suite, for safety, fewer stairs. Arthur Chen. The ground floor suite? I thought Richard converted that into his second office after you left for college. He said the acoustics were better for his calls. A beat of silence. Chloe's smile tightened at the edges. Chloe. Oh no, not that one, the other one, the basement apartment. It's really quite cosy, self-contained.
Gives her a sense of independence.
Arthur's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. Arthur Chen. The basement. I see. I represented the Millers a few years back. You might have read about it. A high-profile elder abuse case. Son had moved his mother into let's call it a garden-level apartment in her own home. Convinced her she was a burden, that she was losing her faculties. Got her to sign over power of attorney. He paused, looking directly at David, then at Chloe. His kindly grandfather persona had evaporated, replaced by the ghost of a litigator, Arthur Chen. It became quite messy. The state has, shall we say, a very particular interest in such arrangements now. Very strict definitions of fiduciary duty, undue influence. It's a legal minefield. One has to be so careful to ensure everything is done for the right reasons, and is perceived to be done for the right reasons. David's knuckles were white where he gripped his armchair. Chloe's teacup rattled in its saucer.
David, this is nothing like that. We are taking care of my mother.
Arthur Chen. His warm smile returns disarmingly fast. Of course you are, my boy. Of course. That's why I'm here, to see her. Now, if you don't mind, I won't take up much more of your time, but I really must say hello to her myself. Alone, if possible. Old friends chat, you understand. We have decades of gossip to catch up on. His tone brooked no argument. It wasn't a request. David, trapped between the law he didn't understand and the man who clearly did, stood up stiffly. David. Fine. This way. The walk to the basement door was silent and heavy. David unlocked it and gestured down the steep wooden stairs. David. She's down there. Arthur looked at the lock, then at David, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. He descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the cramped space. Elizabeth was sitting in her armchair, a book open on her lap. Though she hadn't turned a page in an hour, she looked up as Arthur entered, her heart giving a painful lurch of hope and fear. He closed the door gently behind him, and the oppressive presence of David and Chloe vanished. The kindness in his face was real now, unfiltered. He moved a stool and sat before her, taking one of her hands in his. His was warm and dry. Arthur Chen. Elizabeth. Look at me. Are you safe? The directness of it, the simple, powerful question, broke through the fog of her resignation. Tears welled in her eyes, and she could only nod, a single jerky motion. Arthur Chen. Are you here of your own free will? She hesitated, then shook her head, a small, terrified movement. Elizabeth. They said, for my safety. Arthur Chen. His voice was low, firm, a shield of sound. Listen to me very carefully. You are not alone in this, but we must be smart. Do not sign anything, not a single piece of paper. If they pressure you, you tell them your lawyer, that's me, needs to review it first. You tell them that, and nothing else. Do you understand? She nodded again, wiping a tear from her cheek. Elizabeth. He wants power of attorney. He said he'd go to a judge, say I'm incompetent. Arthur Chen. Let him try. It's a high bar, and it gets a lot higher when the petitioner has a direct financial interest.
and has just moved his mother into a locked basement. For now, we stall. We gather our strength. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small burner phone. Mia had given her. He took it from her, his fingers moving with surprising dexterity. Arthur Chen. This was a good first step. Very good. I'm installing a messaging app. It's fully encrypted, end-to-end, safer than a phone call. My contact is saved as Book Club. You contact me for anything. Anything at all. We will talk through this. We will make a plan. He showed her how to use it. His instructions clear and concise. He made her send a test message. The meeting is at 7. He smiled when it came through on his own phone.
Perfect. You're a natural, Elizabeth. Richard always underestimated you.
He stood up, his presence filling the small, damp room with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. It was the first breath of fresh air after a lifetime in a sealed tomb. I'm going back upstairs now. I'm going to remind them that you have friends, that people are watching. You just sit tight, be the frail old woman they want you to be, but in here. He tapped his temple. You be the general. Your move is coming. When he ascended the stairs, David and Chloe were waiting, their anxiety palpable. She seems a bit tired, but it was wonderful to see her. She's a town treasure, that one. A real institution. You take good care of her. People notice these things. He didn't wait for a reply, simply collecting his coat and letting himself out. The front door clicked shut, leaving David and Chloe standing in a silence that was louder and more threatening than any argument. They were no longer just dealing with an old woman. They were dealing with a lawyer. That night the house was still, but the digital world was alive. Under the single bare bulb of the basement, Elizabeth's fingers, once hesitant, now moved with purpose across the small screen of the burner phone. Elizabeth, text message to Book Club. It's time. Arthur Chen, text message. Mia is ready. What is the plan? Elizabeth, text message. Distraction, loud, expensive, and focused on Chloe. She needs to be occupied for at least 15 minutes. The study. A few minutes later, on the second floor, Mia stood outside Chloe and David's bedroom door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a deep breath, clutched the bottle in her hand, and walked with false nonchalance into the master bathroom. The new white rug, ostentatiously plush and offensively pristine, was spread out before the double vanity. It was Chloe's latest pride and joy. Mia fumbled, her hand shaking. And then a small, feigned gasp. The bottle of nail polish. Not just any nail polish, but a viscous, jet-black concoction filled with silver glitter tumbled from her hand. It didn't just spill, it shattered. An explosion of black, sparkling goo spread across the immaculate white fibres like a toxic oil slick. The shriek that tore from Chloe's throat a moment later was everything Elizabeth had hoped for. It was a sound of pure, materialistic horror. Chloe. My rug! My Alpamoda Italian silk rug! Mia, what have you done? David came running. The sounds of panic and recrimination echoed through the house, a perfect symphony of chaos. Downstairs, Elizabeth sent her next message. Elizabeth, text message. Now, the study. South wall, third bookshelf from the door. Look for a book. He called it his key. The key to his success. The Prince. Mia, having fled the bathroom under a tirade of abuse, slipped unnoticed into the study. The room smelled of her grandfather, old leather, whiskey, and a faint, acrid scent of deceit. She found the bookshelf. Her eyes scanned the spines, history, finance, biographies of ruthless men, and there it was, an ornate leather-bound copy of Machiavelli's The Prince. It looked older, more distinguished than the others. Her fingers trembled as she followed Elizabeth's next instruction, which had just buzzed on her phone. Elizabeth, text message. Don't pull it out. Push it in. Mia placed her palm on the book's spine and pushed. For a second, nothing happened. She pushed harder, and then, with a low, satisfying click, the entire section of the bookcase swung inwards, revealing not a wall, but a dark, narrow opening. A heavy grey steel door, like that of a bank vault, was set into the concrete. A small, keyless electronic keypad was mounted beside it. Mia, text message. It's a vault door.
Code. Elizabeth, text message. His vanity was his only weakness, the day he closed his first major deal, the deal that made him. Nor 81972. Mia's fingers punched in the numbers. A green light flashed, and a heavy clunk echoed from within the door. She pulled the handle. It swung open silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a small windowless room. The air that billowed out was cold and stale, the smell of secrets left to rot. There were no stacks of cash, no gold bars, just metal shelves floor to ceiling, lined with dozens upon dozens of identical grey accounting ledgers. It was a library of crime. Mia's hand shook as she pulled one down. She opened it. The pages were filled with Richard Vance's meticulous, elegant script. Columns of numbers, names of shell corporations, dates of transfers, notes in the margins. It was a detailed, undeniable record of a criminal empire built on real estate fraud, kickbacks, and systematic money laundering that had been running for decades. Names jumped out at her, powerful figures in town, politicians, business leaders, all of them implicated. She relayed the discovery in frantic, whispered texts. But Elizabeth had one more instruction.
Elizabeth, look on the desk. There should be a smaller book, black leather, his journal.
On a small, simple desk at the back of the vault, there it was, a personal journal. Mia opened it. The venom on the pages was even colder than the numbers in the ledgers. It was filled with Richard's unfiltered thoughts, and they were almost entirely about his son.
October 12th. David came to me today with another one of his half-baked ideas. The boy has no vision, no ruthlessness. He sees the family name as a prize he has won, not a weapon to be wielded. He is a pathetic disappointment. He has my name but none of my nature. January 5th. He wants control. He thinks he is ready.
He is a child, playing with a loaded gun. He will ruin everything I have built, not through malice, but through sheer, breathtaking incompetence. Mia felt a wave of nausea. She flipped towards the end, to the final entries. Her blood ran cold. April 2nd. The doctors give me weeks. I told David everything tonight. I laid the map of my life's work at his feet. Not the clean version, the real one. The accounts, the partners, the bodies buried in paperwork. I needed to see if he had the stomach for it, if he could carry the burden. April 3rd. His reaction was not what I expected. Not fear, not disgust. Greed. I saw it in his eyes. He doesn't want to protect the legacy. He wants to cannibalize it. He spoke of blackmailing the partners, of squeezing them for a bigger piece.
using my life's work as his own personal leverage. He learned nothing. The fool. He will burn himself and this family to the ground. Mia snapped the journal shut, her hands trembling. She took photos of the key pages, of the ledgers, sending them all through the secure app. Upstairs, Chloe's hysterics were finally winding down into a low, furious muttering. Mia's window was closing. She placed everything back exactly as she found it, swung the heavy bookcase shut, and slipped out of the study, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Down in the basement, Elizabeth looked at the images on her phone. The proof, the motive, the final damning portrait of the two men who had defined and constrained her life. Richard, the architect of the prison, and David, the eager, incompetent jailer. Her grief for her husband, already long dead, was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Her fear of her son was replaced by a profound, righteous anger. The whispers of the past had become a roar. The next morning, Elizabeth made a call. Not on the burner phone, but on the landline extension in the basement. A call she knew David might be listening to. She called Arthur.
Elizabeth. Her voice is frail, tired.
Arthur? It's Elizabeth. I've been thinking about what you said, about getting things in order. I think it's time to sell the house. I can't stay here. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Arthur's voice came, full of practiced concern. Arthur Chen. Elizabeth, are you sure? It's a big decision. Perhaps we should talk it through. Elizabeth. No, my mind is made up. It's too much. The memories. David and Chloe have been wonderful, but it's their life now. I need something smaller, simpler. Please, Arthur, can you handle it for me? A public auction, quick, clean. I want it over with. She hung up. She knew David would have heard. Let him think it was a victory, a sign of her surrender. Let him believe she was a dotty old woman running away. The real conversation happened over the secure app. Elizabeth. Text message. He took the bait. Now we move. Arthur Chen. Text message. The listing is being prepared.
I'm writing the copy myself. It'll be effective in 1 week. Are you ready for the storm? Elizabeth text message. I have been living in the storm for 50 years. I am the storm. 2 days later, it began. It didn't start with a formal announcement or a sign in the yard. It started online. A new listing appeared on all the major real estate sites, and it was immediately shared to the town's local Facebook groups, its community forums, its Twitter feeds. The listing for the Vance estate. The pictures were stunning. Professional shots of the grand facade, the sprawling gardens, the elegant, empty rooms. But it was the tagline, crafted by Arthur with the precision of a poet-assassin, that set the internet on fire. For public auction, the historic Vance estate, a family legacy with all its contents, must be sold. An unprecedented opportunity to own a piece of history, discover the secrets within its walls. Secrets. That one word was a match thrown on gasoline. The post went viral. The comments exploded.
Secrets? What secrets? Is everything okay with the Vances? I heard David Vance took over all his father's business. Smells like trouble. All its contents must be sold. Sounds like a fire sale.
Someone's desperate. Chloe Vance was just posting on Instagram last week about their forever home. This is weird. Chloe discovered it while scrolling through her phone, sipping a morning latte. She saw the post shared by a local socialite with the caption, "OMG, what is happening here?" She clicked the link. Her face went from confused to pale to a mask of pure fury. The latte mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. A sharp, piercing scream brought David running from the study. David. "What is it? What's wrong?" She didn't speak. She just thrust the phone at him, her hand shaking violently. He read the listing. He read the tagline. He read the comments. His face, which had been a picture of smug satisfaction for 2 days, crumpled.
What is this? This is impossible. She can't do this. I haven't signed off on anything.
As if on cue, they heard a vehicle pull up outside. They rushed to the window. A white van with the Channel 8 News logo on its side was parking across the street. A reporter and a cameraman were getting out, setting up a tripod, aiming their lens directly at the house. Their home, their prize, their symbol of status and inherited power. Was no longer a private palace. It was a public spectacle. A scandal in the making. David's shock curdled into apoplectic rage. He wasn't in control. He had never been in control. He had been played by his mother, the frail, confused woman in the basement. He tore out of the living room, Chloe close behind him, his face a thundercloud of hate. He wrenched open the basement door and stormed down the stairs, not even bothering to close it behind him. The night before the auction, the air in the house was thick with a toxic silence. David and Chloe had spent the day fielding calls from baffled friends, suspicious business associates, and one very aggressive local reporter. Their carefully constructed world was crumbling, and they knew exactly who held the detonator. They didn't knock. The basement door flew open with a crash, slamming against the wall. David and Chloe stood there, silhouetted against the light from the hallway, their faces twisted with a feral rage that stripped away all pretense of civility. "You senile, vindictive old hag. What have you done? You're ruining us. You're ruining everything." David strode forward, his large frame seeming to suck all the air out of the small room. He loomed over Elizabeth, who remained seated in her armchair, a book resting in her lap. She didn't look up. "You will call this off, now. You will call your lawyer, and you will tell him you've changed your mind. That you are confused. Do you understand me?" Elizabeth slowly placed a bookmark in her novel and closed it, setting it carefully on the small table beside her. She looked up at her son. Her eyes were not fearful. They were not angry. They were clear, calm, and as cold as a winter sea. "Elizabeth." "No." The single word, spoken so quietly, was more powerful than a shout. It infuriated him. "David, I am your son. This house is my birthright. You will not do this to me." He was pleading now, his rage mixed with a pathetic, childish desperation. Chloe, seeing his weakness, stepped in. "Chloe, we took you in. We were trying to help you. And this is how you repay us? By humiliating us in front of the entire town. Everything we've worked for." Elizabeth. Her gaze shifts to Chloe, dissecting her. "Everything you've worked for? Or everything you've waited for? There is a difference." David's control finally snapped. He lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her fragile skin. "David, you will listen to me." But Elizabeth didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. The woman he was grabbing was not the same woman he had locked down here weeks ago. That woman was a ghost. This woman was made of iron. She slowly, deliberately looked from his hand on her arm up to his face. She held his gaze. She didn't show them the ledgers. She didn't mention the journal. The evidence was an atomic bomb. You don't use it for a border skirmish. You use a single, perfectly aimed bullet. Elizabeth. Her voice is calm, almost conversational, but it cuts through the room like shattered glass. Let go of my arm, David. He was so taken aback by her tone that he instinctively loosened his grip. Elizabeth, tell me, how is the Henderson Development Project coming along? You must be so busy with it. I'm sure Mr. Henderson would be fascinated to learn what really happened to his original investment. David's face froze. The blood drained from it, leaving a pasty grey mask of shock.
Elizabeth.
You were so young then. Your first real test. Father was so disappointed in how you handled it. He told me you were clumsy. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes boring into his. She recited the details from the ledger, her memory perfect, her delivery flawless. Elizabeth. The 23rd of May, 2008, the initial wire transfer. $1.2 million intended for the escrow account with Sterling Financial. Except it never arrived, did it? It was rerouted through a shell company in the Caymans, Apex Holdings, a name your father favoured for such things. Mr. Henderson still thinks it was a tragic clerical error, one that your father graciously covered from his own funds to save the deal, but it wasn't, was it, David? It was your mistake. Your theft. And your father cleaned it up. It was a detail only Richard, David, and now Elizabeth could possibly know. It was the first secret, the first sin. David stumbled backward, as if he'd been physically struck. A choked, guttural sound escaped his throat. He looked at his mother, but he wasn't seeing a frail old woman. He was seeing the ghost of his father, the arbiter of all his failures, speaking through her. Chloe stared at him, her own fury forgotten, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. She saw the truth in the absolute collapse of his face. The guilt was written there, stark and undeniable. He wasn't the powerful heir she had married. He was a fraud, a thief, a failure, propped up by his father's crimes, and now exposed by his mother's strength. The power dynamic in the small, damp basement hadn't just shifted, it had been irrevocably shattered. The storm of their fury was over, broken against the sea wall of her resolve. Silence descended, a heavy, suffocating silence filled only by David's ragged breathing. Elizabeth sat in her armchair, calm and still. She held all the cards, and they both knew it. The day of the auction dawned with a cruel, brilliant sun. I didn't go to the house. Arthur insisted I stay with him in his quiet, mahogany-panelled office, a world away from the spectacle. He set up a large monitor on his desk, tuned to a live feed from a local news channel. "It's better this way, Elizabeth," he'd said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've fought your war, now you just watch the victory parade." A victory parade. It felt more like a public autopsy. The camera panned across the front lawn, my lawn, now trampled by 100 different pairs of shoes. It was a carnival of ruin. News vans from every local station, and even a few national ones, were parked along the curb, their satellite dishes pointing to the sky like metallic sunflowers. Neighbours, I hadn't spoken to in years, stood in tight, whispering clusters, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and feigned sympathy. They pointed at the house, at the windows, at the professionally printed auction signs staked into the manicured grass. My hydrangeas, Richard's pride and joy, were being crushed by a sound technician's heavy boots. I felt a strange, detached pang of regret for the flowers. Then the camera found them. David and Chloe. They stood on the porch, just outside the open front door like statues in their own museum of failure. David wore a severe, dark suit, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching even on the screen. He was trying to project an image of stoicism, of a man wronged but unbroken. But his eyes, darting from the news crews to the bidders, betrayed him. He was a cornered animal, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Chloe was a different story. She was visibly crumbling. Her perfectly styled hair was starting to wilt in the humid air, and she kept tugging at the sleeve of her expensive silk blouse. She held her phone in a white-knuckled grip, but she wasn't looking at it. She was staring at the crowd, her face pale, her mask of smug superiority shattered. For the first time, she looked her age. She looked lost. They were ghosts haunting the scene of their own demise. A reporter, a young woman with a microphone and a predatory smile, broke from the scrum and tried to approach them. "Mr. Vance, Chloe, a quick word about the allegations? What do you say to claims that this house is being sold out from under you?" David didn't even look at her. He just took a step back, pulling Chloe with him, the heavy oak door closing with a soft, final click. They were trapped inside. Prisoners of the fortress they had tried to steal. Arthur placed a cup of tea beside my hand. "They can't run from this," he murmured, his eyes on the screen. "Everywhere they go, this story will follow them. The house, the money. It was never about the bricks and mortar, was it? It was about power. And now they have none." The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a crisp suit, took his place on a small, elevated platform. He tapped the microphone, and his voice boomed across the lawn, amplified and impersonal. "All right, folks, let's get started on this magnificent property, a true gem in the heart of the community. We'll start the bidding at $2 million. My breath hitched. $2 million. Richard had paid less than a tenth of that 50 years ago. The bidding started immediately, a flurry of hands and numbered paddles. The camera zoomed in on the bidders. They were a mix of wealthy-looking couples, sharp-eyed developers, and a few people who looked like they were there just to be part of the drama. 2.1 from the gentleman in the front. Do I hear 2.2? The price climbed with sickening speed. 2.5. 3 million. 3.2. With each new number, I felt another invisible chain falling away. This wasn't just a house being sold, it was the value of my prison, my silence, my long-suffering obedience being quantified and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Every dollar was a vindication. Every raised paddle was a vote in my favor. Chloe's Instagram posts flashed in my mind, the filtered photos of my living room, captioned with lies about caring for her beloved mother-in-law. The performative grief, the carefully curated image of a perfect family. Now the whole world was seeing the reality behind the filter. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Vance Estate auctioned amid family dispute, allegations of elder abuse. 3.5 million, the auctioneer shouted, his voice ringing with excitement. 3.5 from the lady in blue. Do I hear 3.6? 3.6 from the developer in the back. It's between the two of you now, folks." The price shot past anything the market could have predicted. It had become a story, a piece of local law, and people were paying for the notoriety as much as the property. 4 million, the woman in blue called out, her voice clear and strong. The developer shook his head, lowering his paddle. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. 4 million going once, going twice. His gavel hovered in the air. A tiny instrument of judgment, sold for $4 million to paddle number 72. The crowd erupted in a smattering of applause and excited chatter. The camera pushed through the people, focusing on the winner. She was a poised woman in a simple but elegant blue dress, the one who had made the final bid. The reporter who had tried to corner David was now at her side. "Ma'am, an incredible price. Can you tell us who you're representing today?" The woman smiled. A calm, professional expression. "Of course, I'm Elora Vance, no relation. Director of Acquisitions for the Phoenix Foundation." Arthur let out a low whistle beside me. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. I knew of the Phoenix Foundation. Everyone did. They were a prominent national charity. The reporter's eyes widened. The Phoenix Foundation, the organization that provides shelters for abuse survivors. "That's correct," Elora said, her voice carrying clearly over the microphone. "We specialize in converting properties like this into high-end, secure and supportive sanctuaries for women and children escaping situations of domestic and psychological abuse. We believe that healing begins with a safe and beautiful environment." The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost poetic. The reporter was speechless for a moment, letting the weight of the statement settle over the crowd. The whispers stopped. The neighbours looked at each other, their gossip turning to stunned comprehension. The home that Richard had ruled with an iron fist, the home where David and Chloe had tried to entomb me, the very foundation of which was built on lies and cruelty, would now become a beacon of hope for women just like me. My prison was about to become a sanctuary. On the screen, the front door opened a crack. I could just see David's face, ashen and hollowed out before the door slammed shut again. The humiliation was absolute. It was more than a loss of a house. It was a public and brutal condemnation of their entire existence. I looked away from the monitor and out the window of Arthur's office. The sky was clear and blue. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I just felt still. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. A week later, the consequences began to cascade, swift and merciless. Following Arthur's meticulous instructions, a bonded courier with no knowledge of the sender or the contents delivered a plain, sturdy box to the front desk of the regional FBI headquarters. Inside, wrapped in simple brown paper, were Richard's ledgers. The meticulous, damning record of his secret life of fraud and corruption. There was no note, no return address, just the cold, hard facts, bound in faded leather. I imagined the moment a junior agent opened the first page, the dawning realization of what they were holding. It didn't take long. The story of the auction had already primed the media and law enforcement. The anonymous delivery was the spark that ignited the entire forest. I watched the fallout, not on a live feed, but on my new tablet from the comfort of a plush armchair in the extended stay hotel suite Arthur had arranged. News alerts popped up one after another, each one a tremor from the earthquake I had started. Prominent local banker resigns, FBI investigation cited. Police chief placed on administrative leave amid corruption probe. Vance financial web widens, multiple arrests expected. The men Richard had called his friends, his peers, the pillars of the community, were being toppled one by one. Their empires of quiet corruption built over decades crumbled in a matter of days. And then the one I was waiting for. It didn't come as a news alert, it came from Mia. She sent me a link to a video on TikTok. It was shaky, filmed from a window across the street. The flashing red and blue lights of police cars painted eerie, dancing patterns on the facade of my old house. The front door was wide open. 2 plainclothes agents were leading David down the front steps. He wasn't wearing a suit now. He was in wrinkled sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hands cuffed behind his back. He didn't look defiant. He didn't look angry. He just looked small, defeated. Chloe ran out onto the porch after him, screaming his name.
It wasn't a cry of support. It was a wail of fury and despair, the sound of a woman watching her entire world burn to the ground. She knew in that moment that everything was gone. The money, the status, the house, the life she had been so desperate to secure. The video was only 15 seconds long, but it was a lifetime of ruin captured on a teenager's phone, set to some trending, ironically upbeat pop song. His public humiliation was complete. The charges were extensive: complicity in his father's schemes, and more immediately, attempted blackmail of Richard's former partners.
Up in the world, I would word, I would use.
He had known about the ledgers. He had planned to use them, not for justice, but for his own gain. He was, in the end, exactly like his father. The cycle for him had not been broken. It had simply ended in a prison cell. A few days later, I had a meeting, not with a lawyer or a police officer, but with Elara Vance, the director from the Phoenix Foundation. We met in a quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes of the town. She had the same calm, compassionate energy I'd seen on the news. "Elizabeth," she began, her voice warm, "I can't thank you enough. What you've done, turning that house into a symbol of hope, it's extraordinary." "The house was just a building, Elara," I said, stirring my tea. "It was the story that gave it power. Now it has a new story to tell. And we will make sure it's a good one. We've already had architects walk through. We're designing it to be a place of light and healing. The basement, we're turning it into a library and art therapy studio." The thought of my cold, damp prison becoming a place of creativity and knowledge brought a lump to my throat. "That's good," I managed to say. "There's something else," I told her. Reaching into my bag, I pulled out a book. It wasn't one of the financial ledgers. It was older, more worn. Richard's personal journal. The one filled not with numbers, but with words of calculated cruelty, with his philosophy of control and emotional dominance. The one that chronicled my 50 years of psychological abuse in his own handwriting. I pushed it across the table. "I want you to have this." Elara looked at the journal, then back at me, her expression questioning. "It's not about revenge," I explained, my voice steady. "His financial crimes are for the law to handle. This is different. This is the weapon he used against me. The insidious kind that leaves no bruises. Use it. Use his own words to teach others. Create workshops, write articles, train your staff, show women how to recognize the patterns, the language of control, the slow erosion of the self. Let his evil finally serve some good. Let his words, which he used to build a prison for me, be the key that unlocks the cells for others." It was an act of transmutation. I was taking the raw toxic material of my pain and forging it into a tool for someone else's liberation. I wasn't erasing my past, I was giving it purpose. Elara picked up the journal, holding it with a kind of reverence. She looked at me, and I saw tears welling in her eyes. "Elizabeth," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "this is the most powerful donation we have ever received. This won't just build a shelter, this will help build lives." In that moment, I knew I was truly free. My story was no longer just mine, it belonged to them now. To the women who would live in that house and the women who would learn from Richard's hateful words. The ashes of my old life were becoming the foundation for countless new beginnings. 3 months passed. The noise of the auction, the arrests, the scandals, it all faded like a distant storm moving out to sea. I found a place of my own, a bright, modern apartment on the coast. 2 hours away from the town that had been my gilded cage for half a century. The walls were white, the furniture was new and chosen by me, and the air smelled of salt and possibility. There was no heavy, dark wood, no oppressive portraits. Just my books, my art, and a large glass door that opened onto a balcony overlooking the ocean. I sat at a small, elegant desk, a piece of thick, cream-coloured stationery before me. I was writing to Mia. She had done what I never could at her age. She had chosen herself. After her father's arrest, she had severed ties, packed her bags, and enrolled in her first semester of college on the other side of the country, using a scholarship she had won on her own merit.
We spoke on the phone every week, but some things needed to be written.
My dearest Mia, I began, the pen flowing smoothly across the paper. I'm looking out at the ocean as I write this. The horizon is so vast and clear today, it feels like you can see forever. It reminds me of you and the future you are building for yourself. I know the past few months have been difficult, and I can only imagine the conversations you've endured, the judgment you may have faced. People will have told you that I destroyed our family. I need you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that isn't true. A family is meant to be a sanctuary, not a prison. It should be a place where you are loved for who you are, not for what you can provide or how well you obey. For 50 years, I lived inside a structure that looked like a family from the outside, but was in reality a monument to one man's ego and another's weakness. It was a cycle of abuse, passed from father to son, a quiet poison that contaminated everything it touched. I did not destroy that family, my dear Mia. I simply held up a mirror to what it had always been. I refused to let the poison seep into another generation, into you. My only regret is that I did not find the strength to do it sooner. But strength is a curious thing. Sometimes it's a mighty roar, and sometimes it's a whisper in a basement, a quiet decision to no longer be silent. Your secret visits, that small, untraceable phone. That was the spark, Mia. You gave me the spark that lit the fire. Never let anyone make you feel guilty for choosing your own survival. Never let the expectations of others become the bars of your own cage. You are brave, and you are brilliant, and I am endlessly proud of the woman you are becoming. I paused, rereading the words. It was all true. I took a cheque from my desk drawer. It was from the proceeds of the house sale, a substantial amount made out in her name.
I folded it carefully and tucked it inside the letter. Use this for your tuition, for your books, for travel, for anything that brings you joy and expands your world. See it not as a gift from me, but as a debt repaid by the universe. It is the first brick in the foundation of your own truly free life. The cycle of abuse ends with me. The legacy of strength begins with you.
All my love, Grandma Elizabeth.
I sealed the envelope, a sense of profound peace settling over me. I walked out onto the balcony, the sea breeze cool and clean on my face. It was the first time in over 50 years I felt the wind and didn't feel watched. I was not Richard's wife. I was not David's mother. I was not a victim, a prisoner, or a ghost. I was just Elizabeth. And I was free. I looked out at the endless blue horizon where the water met the sky, and for the first time in a lifetime, a quiet, knowing smile graced my lips. It was a smile that belonged only.
Elizabeth's story is a powerful testament to the fact that it's never too late to reclaim your life. The quietest voices can start the loudest revolutions. If her journey from silence to strength resonated with you, let us know in the comments which moment you found most empowering. Your stories matter, and sharing them is how we remind each other of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.